when you watch a professional boxing match, the violence is basically the entire point. Right.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
But there is still this, like, undeniable structure to it. You have the ropes surrounding the canvas, literally boxing the fighters in.
Yeah, keeping it contained.
Exactly. And you have a referee standing right there in the middle of the action watching every single move. Like, you can't hit below the belt. You can't hit your opponent when they're already down on the mat.
Right, because it's sanctioned, highly regulated violence.
Yeah.
The boundaries are there to contain the brutality so it doesn't, just spill over to something totally unrecognizable.
But then if you think about, like, a street fight or a riot or some brawl in an alleyway behind a bar.
A totally different story.
Right. The ropes are completely gone. The referee has fled the scene. It is just pure, unadulterated chaos where anything goes. And for a long time, I think that is exactly how you, me, and honestly, most people pictured war.
Yeah, I mean, we view it as a complete legal vacuum, like the ultimate street fight, but fought with artillery and airstrikes.
Exactly. Just a dark, terrifying place where the rules just sort of evaporate into the smoke and humanity reverts to its absolute basest instincts.
Which is a really natural assumption to make when you look at the footage from conflict zones.
But today, we are going to show you that the darkest, most chaotic arenas on Earth-like actual active war zones are actually draped in this invisible, incredibly intricate web of rules.
Yeah, it's pretty wild once you see it.
So, welcome to the deep dive. If you're someone who craves a truly thorough understanding of complex global systems, but, you want to skip the overwhelming academic jargon, you are in exactly the right place today.
We're so glad you're here with us.
Today, we're analyzing a source document, a framework that looks, at first glance, like the driest international law syllabus imaginable.
Yep.
It's called the Legal Framework Ethics of Humanitarian Action.
And, while it may read like a final exam study guide for an international law student, it's full of treaty dates, legal definitions, UN resolutions. The reality of what this framework represents is profoundly different.
It really is. Once you start peeling back the layers, you realize you're basically looking at the ultimate survival rule book for humanity.
The absolute bedrock of how we keep each other alive.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive is to decode this invisible safety net. We're going to figure out what the rules of war actually are, how healthcare workers somehow manage to operate on the literal front lines of combat without being killed, and crucially, what happens when the belligerents just decide to tear up the rule book.
Which, as we'll see, happens a lot.
Yeah.
But establishing that baseline is so crucial. War is so often broadcast to us as total senseless devastation. But this document reveals a surprisingly rigid legal architecture.
Right, it didn't just appear out of nowhere.
Exactly, no, it wasn't thought up overnight. It was built brick by brick over decades, usually in the immediate aftermath of unspeakable atrocities.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And it was specifically designed to place hard limits on violence and to protect the most vulnerable people on the planet when, everything else is just falling apart.
So before we even look at the specific laws, I think we have to understand the philosophy that makes it possible for an aid worker to stand in the middle of a battlefield and not be treated as just another target.
Yeah, the foundational mindset.
Exactly. Our source outlines 4 foundational pillars here: humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. And I'll be honest, they sound like corporate buzzwords at first.
They really do, like something on a motivational poster.
Right. But in a conflict zone, they are literally a matter of life and death. So let's start with humanity. The framework defines this as the imperative to save and protect life and to alleviate human suffering wherever it is found.
That phrase right there, wherever it is found, that is the engine driving the entire humanitarian enterprise.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
It means that human suffering must be addressed simply because it exists. That's it. It's the core motivation that compels a doctor to pack a bag and fly into a disaster zone.
Right, they aren't going to, further a geopolitical goal.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
They're going because the sheer existence of human suffering demands a response from us.
Which flows directly into the second pillar, which is impartiality. This requires helping based solely on need, with absolutely zero discrimination.
Zero. Not at all.
And it explicitly dictates that aid cannot be used to further political or military objectives. And I try to imagine the sheer psychological discipline this requires. Imagine you have a triage tent.
Okay, yeah.
And you have a wounded soldier in there who just, shelled a civilian neighborhood. And right next to him is a wounded child from that exact same neighborhood.
It's a horrific scenario,
Yeah.
but it happens every day. And the principle of impartiality dictates that if the soldier's wounds are more immediately life-threatening, the doctor must treat the soldier first.
Wow.
Yeah, your personal politics,
Yeah.
your moral outrage, your biases, they all have to be completely suppressed.
You just have to shut it off?
You have to. You treat based strictly on the medical math of who needs the intervention most urgently.
That is just incredible discipline. Okay, so the third and fourth pillars are where I think a lot of public confusion lies. And honestly, I was confused by this too. Neutrality and independence.
Yeah, people mix these up all the time.
Right. We use them interchangeably in normal conversation, but this legal framework draws a massive, heavy line between them.
A very distinct legal line.
So neutrality is defined as not taking any sides, while independence is being entirely separate from political, military, or commercial objectives. So functionally, how do those two concepts actually play out differently on the ground?
The best way to think about it is think of neutrality as your behavior and independence as your anatomy.
Okay, behavior versus anatomy. I like that.
Yeah. So neutrality means you aren't picking a side in the fight. You aren't smuggling ammunition in the back of your ambulances, right?
Yeah.
And you aren't feeding reconnaissance data back to a government intelligence agency. You are just treating the wounded. You are acting neutrally.
Okay, and independence.
Independence is structural. It's about the underlying machinery of your organization, specifically like where your money and your marching orders come from. You cannot take funding that comes with strings attached.
Oh, I see. So if a humanitarian group is entirely funded by a government that is actively dropping bombs in that specific conflict,
Yes.
the opposing side is never going to view that aid group as a neutral actor, even if their behavior is totally neutral,
Exactly the issue. They will be viewed as the soft power wing of the invading army.
which makes them a target.
Precisely. If an aid organization loses its structural independence, it immediately loses the trust of the warring parties. The moment you're perceived as an extension of a military objective, you stop being a protected humanitarian and you become a legitimate military target.
So these principles are not just high-minded ethics. They are literally the operational armor keeping these aid workers alive.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's their armor.
So those four pillars guide the behavior of the people doing the work. But the actual legal framework they operate within is called International Humanitarian Law, or IHL.
Yes, the big rule book.
And the sources tell us this is the body of rules that seeks to limit the effects of armed conflict by protecting non-combatants and restricting the weapons and tactics armies can use.
Right.
But there is a massive caveat here that the document points out. IHL is only applicable in an armed conflict. The violence actually has to reach a certain boiling point for these laws to even activate.
Yeah, and the threshold of conflict is actually a massive point of legal contention globally. IHL does not apply to, like, a standard domestic riot or a spike in gang violence or a disorganized political uprising.
Right, so if there's a protest that turns violent, the Geneva Conventions don't suddenly apply.
Exactly. For IHL to sort of turn on, the situation has to cross a legal threshold where the intensity of the violence and the organization of the armed groups involved reach the level of a true armed conflict.
Okay, so until that line is crossed, what rules apply?
Domestic criminal law and international human rights law.
So the local police and the local courts handle it.
Correct. But once the violence scales up, once you have, say, organized militias holding territory or state militaries actively engaging each other, the standard laws of peacetime are suspended and IHL takes over.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the framework divides the sources of IHL into two main categories: treaty law and customary international law.
Right.
Treaty law seems straightforward to me. Governments convene in a city, they argue over a document for a few weeks, and they sign it.
Yep. Put pen to paper.
But customary international law is described in the text as being independent of treaties. It derives from, quote, general practice accepted as law.
Yeah.
And I have to push back on how effective this could possibly be in the real world.
It's definitely a concept that challenges our standard understanding of how laws work, for sure.
Right, because to me, customary international law just sounds like the unwritten rules of society. You know, like letting people off an elevator before you push your way on.
Sure. Yeah.
It's a general practice we all accept, but if someone barges onto the elevator, I can't, like, have them arrested. It's an unwritten rule. So how do you enforce an unwritten legal concept in a life-or-death military scenario against a sovereign nation that points out, hey, we never signed a treaty agreeing to this?
So the elevator etiquette is actually a great starting point for the analogy, but you just have to scale the stakes up to, well, the survival of the human race.
Okay, that's quite a scale up.
Yeah. Think of customary international law less as manners and more as the inescapable gravity of the international system. It binds everyone, regardless of whether a specific head of state put a pen to a piece of paper.
Give me a tangible example of that gravity in action so I can wrap my head around it.
Sure. Let's take a specific weapon system, like chemical weapons. Suppose a newly formed nation or rebel group that just seized power hasn't gone through the bureaucratic process of signing the specific international treaties banning chemical warfare.
Right, they never signed on the dotted line.
Exactly. But if they use mustard gas on a battlefield, they cannot go to an international tribunal later and say, well, we never signed the treaty, so technically we didn't break the law.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, customary international law steps in and says, it doesn't matter. The overwhelming consensus of human civilization over a vast period of time has established that using chemical weapons is a universal crime.
Wow.
So customary law essentially fills the gaps to ensure there isn't a legal black hole where atrocities can happen without accountability simply because of missing paperwork.
That is fascinating. It's like the ultimate global safety net.
Exactly.
But obviously, you still want the hard rules codified in ink whenever possible. Which brings us to the bedrock of this entire system. When you are talking about treaty law in armed conflict, you are really talking about the Geneva Conventions of 1949.
The absolute cornerstone of modern civilization's attempt to regulate its own destructive nature.
The framework outlines 4 distinct Geneva Conventions. And I want to walk through these, but I don't want to just read a list to you. I want to understand the psychological state of the world that actually drafted these rules.
That's a really important context to have.
Right. So the first Geneva Convention protects wounded and sick soldiers on land who are no longer fighting. The term the source uses is hors de combat, meaning out of the fight.
Yep.
It protects medics, it recognizes the Red Cross emblem, and this part got to me. It mandates the protection of the dead from despoilment.
Yeah.
I mean, having to write down a law saying do not rob or mutilate corpses, that tells a very dark story about what was happening.
It does. You really have to view the 1949 conventions through the lens of 1945.
Right after the war.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The authors had just crawled out of the wreckage of the Second World War. They had witnessed industrial-scale slaughter, the mass looting of the dead on battlefields across Europe and Asia, and the systematic targeting of medical infrastructure.
So this wasn't just some academic exercise.
Not at all. They weren't writing theoretical philosophy. They were writing direct, desperate responses to the unfathomable horrors they just lived through.
Wow.
So the first convention firmly establishes that a soldier is only a legitimate target while they are an active threat. The millisecond they surrender or are incapacitated by injury, they transition from a target to a protected person.
Okay, so that's the first one. Now, the second Geneva Convention is essentially the naval translation of the first, right?
Basically, yes. It applies to conflict at sea, protecting the wounded, the sick, and shipwrecked sailors, as well as guaranteeing the safety of hospital ships.
Okay, but the third Geneva Convention feels like a massive historical reckoning to me. It defines the status of prisoners of war, strictly forbids torture, and dictates the rules for their eventual release.
Yeah, and again, think about the context. Millions of prisoners of war perished in camps during WWII, from starvation, forced labor, medical experimentation, outright execution.
Just horrific conditions.
Good. Unimaginable. So the third convention was an attempt to fundamentally redefine what capture actually means. It established that a captured soldier is simply removed from the geopolitical chessboard.
They're just on pause.
Right. They're to be kept safe, housed, and fed, and when the hostilities end, they must be sent home. They aren't criminals simply for having worn the uniform of their country, and they cannot be punished for participating in the war.
And then we reach the fourth Geneva Convention, which, reading through the notes, represents perhaps the biggest paradigm shift of all.
Huge shift.
It provides protection for the general civilian population and civilian hospitals. It defines the status of a protected civilian and outlines strict rules for military occupations. And honestly, it seems wild to me that it took until 1949 to explicitly write down, do not target civilians.
It does seem late, doesn't it? But prior to 1949, the laws of war were overwhelmingly focused on the combatants themselves. War was really viewed as a clash between armies out on a field somewhere.
Right, soldier versus soldier.
Exactly. But the aerial bombardments of cities like London, Dresden, and Tokyo, and obviously the deployment of atomic weapons, proved that in modern total warfare, Civilians bear the absolute brunt of the suffering.
They're the ones getting wiped out.
Yes. So the Fourth Convention firmly codified that civilians are explicitly excluded from the conflict. You cannot target them, you cannot use them as human shields, and you cannot collectively punish a civilian population for the actions of their military.
Okay, so we have the four conventions covering land, sea, prisoners, and civilians. That's 1949. But the framework moves forward in time to 1977, introducing the additional protocols.
Yes, very important additions.
Protocol extends protections in international armed conflicts, so state versus state. But Protocol 2 elaborates on protections in non-international armed conflicts.
Which means civil wars, internal rebellions, things like that.
And I find this incredibly difficult to wrap my head around. Imagine a state government fighting a rebel group that's actively trying to overthrow them. The state views those rebels as domestic terrorists, not legitimate soldiers.
Right, they see them as criminals.
Exactly. So how do you legally regulate a war where one side doesn't even acknowledge the other side's right to exist?
It is the most delicate needle to thread in international law, honestly. What you are seeing in the 1977 additional protocols is the law struggling to adapt to the changing nature of human conflict.
How so?
Well, after WWII, the era of massive state armies lining up in fields in Europe was largely over. The Cold War era ushered in a massive surge in proxy wars, messy internal strife, decolonization struggles, and asymmetric guerrilla warfare.
So the uniform versus non-uniform conflict.
Precisely. So Protocol 2 is this desperate attempt to pull those messy, internal, irregular fights under the umbrella of IHL. It establishes a baseline of human decency that cannot be crossed, even if a government considers a rebel group to be completely illegitimate insurgents.
So you still can't just wipe out a village because rebels are there.
Exactly. You still cannot massacre civilians in rebel-held territory, and you still cannot torture captured insurgents.
That makes a lot of sense.
And it was around this era that IHL really heavily formalized a concept that governs almost all modern military strategy, which is proportionality.
Okay, proportionality. It sounds so clean in a sterile courtroom setting, but in the fog of war, how does that actually work? Like, how do you mathematically weigh the value of an attack against the human cost?
Proportionality is the agonizing equation. Every single military commander, and frankly their military lawyers, has to run before authorizing a strike.
Military lawyers are right there in the room.
Oh, absolutely. The law states that the anticipated civilian harm, so the incidental loss of life, injury, or damage to civilian infrastructure, cannot be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated.
Okay, give me a scenario because I need to picture this. Let's say there is a vital enemy communications hub, right?
Correct.
But it's located in the basement of a fully occupied civilian apartment building. What happens?
The commander has to weigh the immense military advantage of destroying that comms hub against the reality that bringing the building down will kill dozens of civilians.
Right.
If there is an alternative way to neutralize the target, say a precise raid or cyber attack or severing the external power grid, they are legally obligated to choose the method that minimizes civilian harm.
And if they don't?
If they just level the building with a massive payload because it's easier, the military advantage does not mathematically justify the massive civilian casualty toll. That strike would be disproportionate and therefore a war crime.
Wow.
Yeah. It is a formula designed to act as a handbrake against mindless, excessive destruction.
Okay, so we have this robust, incredibly detailed legal architecture. We have customary law, the Geneva Conventions, the additional protocols, the mathematical equations of proportionality.
Right.
But looking at the source notes, I have to point out a massive, glaring contradiction in the reality of this framework.
Oh, there are a few. Which one?
Well, if the First and Fourth Geneva Conventions explicitly protect hospitals, medical personnel, and civilian infrastructure, why did the international community have to pass entirely separate, modern UN resolutions dedicated specifically to stopping attacks on healthcare? The framework highlights a 2012 World Health Assembly resolution and a 2016 UN Security Council resolution. If the law has been settled since 1949, why did the UN have to pass new resolutions 60 years later saying, essentially, no, seriously, guys, stop bombing hospitals?
It exposes the tragic gap between the existence of a law and the political will to actually enforce it.
Which is incredibly depressing.
It is. The Geneva Conventions laid the legal foundation, but as the nature of warfare evolved in the 21st century, particularly in grueling block-by-block urban conflicts, the international community realized that the foundation was cracking.
Because hospitals were getting hit.
Exactly. Attacks on healthcare weren't just isolated mistakes anymore. They were becoming normalized tactical strategies.
So the 2012 WHA resolution mandated the WHO to systematically collect data on attacks on healthcare,
Right.
and the 2016 UN Security Council resolution demands that all parties comply with IHL, independently investigate violations, and ensure accountability. It feels to me like they are trying to build an inescapable paper trail.
That is exactly the goal. It is the international community's way of shining a blinding spotlight on a specific recurring crime.
You can't ignore it if there's data.
Right. By demanding rigorous data collection and independent investigations, they are stripping away the anonymity and the fog of war excuses that perpetrators rely on. They're telling warring parties, we see you doing this, we are counting every single time an ambulance is hit, and we are building a permanent record for future prosecution.
Okay, but the framework also gets deeply granular about when a hospital actually enjoys that protection and when it loses it.
Yes, the conditions of protection.
The text states, quote, medical units exclusively assigned to medical purposes must be respected and protected in all circumstances. They lose their protection if they are being used outside their humanitarian function to commit acts harmful to the enemy.
This is a critical and often misunderstood nuance of international law. A hospital is a sanctuary, yes, but it is a conditional sanctuary.
Okay, let's play this out. If an armed militia forcibly takes over the top floor of an active pediatric hospital, sets up a sniper nest, and starts firing at approaching troops, while doctors are still desperately performing surgeries on the ground floor, what happens to the hospital's legal force field?
According to the strict letter of IHL, if the facility is actively being used to commit acts harmful to the enemy, it forfeits its absolute protected status. It becomes a military objective.
Oh my God, so they can just bomb the pediatric ward?
Well, no, hang on. The attacking force cannot simply flatten the hospital immediately.
Okay, good.
They still have to abide by the rule of proportionality we just discussed. Furthermore, they are legally required to issue a clear warning with a reasonable time limit demanding that the enemy cease their unlawful use of the hospital.
So they have to say, get out or we shoot.
Exactly. And only after that warning goes unheeded can they attack. And even then, they must take every feasible precaution to spare the civilians inside. The law bends over backward to try and maintain the sanctity of the medical space, placing heavy burdens on both sides.
Which is why having a sniper in a hospital is itself a war crime, right? Because they're endangering the patients.
Exactly. Using human shields is fundamentally illegal.
Now, this brings us to a detail regarding the protection of aid workers that completely blew my mind when I read it. It's about the emblems they wear.
Ah, the emblems.
The framework states, quote, only Red Cross, Red Crescent, and Red Crystal emblems benefit from international legal protection. Other distinctive emblems, for example, MSF Doctors Without Borders, do not.
Yeah, that surprises a lot of people.
I had to read that multiple times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. Doctors Without Borders is arguably the most famous frontline medical humanitarian organization on Earth. Are you telling me their logo doesn't carry the same legal weight as the Red Cross?
It is a fascinating and somewhat jarring quirk of international treaty law.
Why is that?
When the Geneva Conventions were drafted, the authors needed a single, universally recognized, unmistakable visual symbol that signaled absolute neutrality on the battlefield. They codified the Red Cross. And later, they added the Red Crescent and Red Crystal to accommodate different cultural contexts.
Right.
So when a soldier looks down the sight of a rifle and sees a Red Cross, they are legally bound by the treaties their country signed to hold their fire. That specific geometric shape is the literal legal property of the Geneva Conventions.
So what happens when a soldier sees the MSF logo or the logo of some local grassroots medical charity?
Well, the personnel of MSF and those local charities are absolutely protected by the fact that they're civilians and medical workers under the broader rules of IHL.
Okay, so you still cannot shoot them.
Right, you still cannot shoot them.
Okay.
But their specific corporate logo does not possess the magical treaty-bound shield that the Red Cross emblem has.
That feels deeply bureaucratic to me. And in the chaos of a war zone, that level of legal bureaucracy could be the difference between an aid convoy getting waved through a tense checkpoint or getting annihilated by a drone strike because an operator didn't recognize the logo.
Which is exactly why you will often see independent NGOs coordinating very closely with the Red Cross movement or utilizing those universally recognized protective markers on their rooftops in conjunction with their own branding.
Just to be extra safe.
Yes. But from a strict legal treaty perspective, those three emblems, the cross, crescent, and crystal, hold a unique Singular monopoly on visual protection.
Wow. Okay, let's examine another incredibly narrow legal tightrope for medical personnel from the source text. The framework discusses armed medics.
Yeah, this is intense.
It says state practice indicates that the protected status of medical personnel does not cease if they are equipped with light individual weapons solely to defend their patients or themselves against acts of violence. So basically, a medic is allowed to carry a sidearm.
Yes, for self-defense against criminal elements, looters, or, a random mob.
But the very next sentence is a total trapdoor. It says, if they use such weapons in combat against enemy forces acting in conformity with the law of war, notably to resist capture, they forfeit their protection.
Yep.
I mean, put yourself in the shoes of a frontline medic for a second. The sheer psychological terror of this split-second calculation is just unimaginable to me.
It's an impossible situation.
You are holding a weapon. A squad of armed men kicks in the door of your clinic. You have to instantly calculate whether they are a rogue mob that you can legally shoot to protect your patient or an organized enemy unit arriving to legally capture you as a POW.
And if you miscalculate and pull the trigger against a legitimate soldier, you transition from a protected medical worker to an active lethal combatant in the blink of an eye. You lose all your protections.
But how can the law expect a terrified medic to make a flawless legal determination about the status of the men kicking in their door in a split second?
It is an agonizing burden to place on an individual. It really is. But you have to look at the macro logic behind the law here.
What's the macro logic?
The law is trying to protect the integrity of the entire global medical system. If medics were legally permitted to fight back against legitimate capture, then opposing armies would start treating every single medic as a lethal disguised threat.
So they wouldn't even try to capture them.
Exactly. They would throw grenades into clinics and shoot medics on site instead of attempting to capture them. The law demands that medics surrender to legitimate armed forces so that armies trust that a person wearing a medical emblem is never going to shoot at them.
So that absolute trust in the non-lethal nature of the medic is the only thing keeping the whole system from collapsing.
Yes. It's harsh, but it's structural preservation.
It is a harsh, brutal reality. But the framework gets even darker.
It does.
Because we've been analyzing these rules under the assumption that the warring parties are at least trying to follow them, but perhaps failing due to the chaos of combat. But the documents contain this incredibly chilling line.
I know the one you mean.
Let me read it. In various real situations, depriving the enemy and the affiliated population of healthcare is not a side effect of conflict, but a deliberate component of deterrent and punitive military strategy.
It is arguably the most sobering sentence in the entire text.
It changes the entire context of how we consume the news. When you read a headline tomorrow morning that a hospital was destroyed or a water treatment plant was bombed, your mind usually jumps to, oh, tragic accident or collateral damage.
Right.
But this framework is explicitly telling us that it is frequently a calculated, highly cynical military tactic.
It is the weaponization of suffering.
Explain that.
The strategy is to break the psychological will and the physical resilience of a population. If you destroy a city's ability to heal its wounded, if you target the ambulances and bomb the maternity wards, you are sending a message that transcends the physical destruction of a building.
You're destroying their hope.
Exactly. You are telling the population that nowhere is safe, that survival is impossible, and that they must submit or flee.
And obviously, we have to remind you as we discuss this, we're looking at this strictly through the lens of the framework. We're not endorsing any political viewpoints or taking sides in any specific conflicts here. We are just imparting what the source document tells us about the realities of warfare.
Absolutely. The document is just laying bare the brutal reality of these tactics.
And that deliberate strategy is exactly why the strict adherence to medical neutrality and those UN resolutions demanding accountability are so vital. It is this constant, desperate tug of war between the most sophisticated legal safeguards we've ever invented and the absolute worst, most punitive impulses of warfare.
Which is a perfect pivot to the people whose entire job description is to stand in the absolute center of that tug of war.
Exactly. Up to this point, we have covered the dynamics of the battlefield, the medics, the airstrikes, the combatants. But now the conversation shifts to those who disappear from the battlefield.
The unseen victims.
Right. When a soldier surrenders or a civilian is swept up in a mass arrest by an occupying force, how does the law actually reach them? This brings us to the ultimate backstage pass in international conflict, the International Committee of the Red Cross, or the ICRC, and their role in detention centers.
And their mandate is so fascinating. The ICRC operates with a mandate that is entirely unique in the world.
Unique how?
Well, unlike countless NGOs that operate based on general humanitarian goodwill, the ICRC's specific role is literally written into the text of the Geneva Conventions. They are the officially designated guardians of international humanitarian law.
And their goal regarding detainees is straightforward, but honestly, logistically massive. They aim to secure humane treatment for all detainees, regardless of the reasons for their arrest.
Right, the reason doesn't matter to them.
It doesn't matter if the person in the cell is a decorated general, a low-level insurgent, or a civilian suspected of espionage. The ICRC's only concern is ensuring they are treated like a human being.
And they conduct this mission by supporting authorities in creating adequate infrastructure. They aren't just checking boxes.
What are they actually doing in there?
They're inspecting the food supply, they're testing the water quality, checking the ventilation, ensuring there are health services. But arguably their most vital function is acting as the ultimate neutral record keepers.
Okay, because the framework notes that detainee information must be sent to the ICRC Central Tracing Agency to ensure that people don't simply, quote, go missing.
Right. The phenomenon of the disappeared, where people are just thrown into the back of a van and never seen again, is one of the most terrifying tools of unchecked state power.
So the ICRC's job is to basically shine a floodlight into those black sites.
Exactly.
Okay.
And they don't just ask politely for a tour.
No, they don't. The framework lists the 5 golden rules of ICRC visits to detention centers. And reading these, it feels less like a diplomatic visit and more like the most rigorous, uncompromising audit imaginable. It's an all-or-nothing contract with the holding authority.
Let's look at the mechanics of those 5 rules because they are so strict.
Okay, rule number 1. Access to all detainees within a place of detention. Rule number 2, access to all premises and facilities used by and for the detainees. Rule 3, authorization to repeat their visits. Rule 4, the possibility to speak freely and in private with the detainees of their choice. And Rule 5, assurance that the authorities will provide the ICRC with a full list of all detainees or permit the ICRC to compile one themselves.
What those rules mean in practice is that the ICRC absolutely refuses to go on a curated, state-sponsored PR tour of a prison.
No Potemkin villages.
Exactly. If a prison warden meets him at the gate and says, welcome, you can inspect cell blocks A and B, but cell block C and the basement are off limits today for security reasons, the ICRC doesn't compromise. They turn around and walk away.
And this is what I honestly struggle to understand about the geopolitics of this. Why would a warring state, especially like an authoritarian regime with a notorious human rights record, ever agree to give a completely neutral third party, unrestricted, private access to their most guarded, secret prisoners?
Yeah, what's the incentive for the dictator to let the inspectors in?
Exactly.
That is the million-dollar question, and the answer is rooted entirely in the harsh game theory of reciprocity.
Okay, walk us through the game theory.
Imagine State A and State B are locked in a brutal war. State A has captured 1,000 soldiers from State B. The leadership of State A might have a strong desire to treat those prisoners terribly, to starve them, or to interrogate them brutally for intelligence.
Sure.
But State A is acutely aware of one terrifying fact. State B has also captured 1,000 of their soldiers.
Mutually assured destruction, but for prisoners.
Precisely. If State A lets the ICRC in, treats the prisoners humanely, and proves to the international community through the ICRC's audits that they are following the Geneva Conventions, they gain immense political and moral leverage.
Oh, so they can say, look, we're playing by the rules.
Right. They can then demand that State B provide the exact same access and humane treatment for their own captured troops. State A lets the ICRC into their prisons primarily to protect their own citizens who are locked up across the border. It relies entirely on the hope of reciprocal treatment.
It is literally a mutual hostage situation mitigated by an independent auditor. That is wild.
It really is.
And I really want to highlight how vital rule number 4 is, the right to speak freely and in private with detainees. That seems to be the magic bullet of the entire operation.
It is the only way to uncover the truth. Think about it. If a prison guard or an intelligence officer is standing in the corner of the room with a rifle, a prisoner is never ever going to admit that they are being waterboarded in the basement.
Of course not.
But in absolute privacy, the ICRC delegates, who include trained medical doctors, by the way, can document the physical and psychological scars of torture They gather the evidence, and then they do something that is incredibly counterintuitive to how we normally think about human rights advocacy.
Right, they don't hold a press conference.
Almost never. The ICRC operates on a doctrine of strict, uncompromising confidentiality. When they document severe abuse, they don't go to the New York Times, they don't expose the regime on Twitter.
So what do?
They take their findings directly back to the highest levels of the authority running the prison, behind closed doors, and they say, "We have documented systematic torture in your facility. You need to stop this immediately, hold the guards accountable, and improve the conditions, or we will withdraw our services entirely."
That feels so wrong at first glance. Like, we are conditioned to believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant, that you have to expose evil to stop it.
It's a massive philosophical debate within the humanitarian world for sure. But the ICRC's pragmatic calculation is this. If they publicly humiliate a paranoid authoritarian government by exposing their torture chambers, that government will immediately kick the ICRC out of the country.
And then what?
They will never be allowed back into the prisons. The international community might express outrage for a week, but the prisoners will be left alone in the dark, and the torture will likely just get worse.
Wow.
By trading public outrage for confidential access, the ICRC maintains a seat at the table, allowing them to actually improve conditions and save lives from the inside.
It's a fascinating, deeply pragmatic, and incredibly heavy burden to bear. To see the worst of humanity and to literally bite your tongue in public so you can keep saving people in private.
It takes a very specific kind of dedication.
So we've talked extensively about direct violence shootings, bombings, airstrikes, and we've unpacked the complexities of detention. These are very loud, very visible forms of warfare. But the framework details a slower, often invisible method of warfare that directly impacts civilian survival on a massive scale.
Yes, moving away from the loud explosions.
Right, we are moving into the realm of sieges and sanctions.
This is where the legal framework struggles the most against the brutal, grinding realities of modern geopolitical strategy.
Let's start with sieges. The framework drops a total bombshell right at the beginning of this section. It states, quote, "There is no legal definition of a siege in IHL."
Yeah.
How is that legally possible? Sieges have been a foundational tactic of warfare since the walls of Troy. How did the authors of the Geneva Conventions forget to define a siege?
It isn't an oversight, actually. It's a reflection of how difficult it is to ban a military tactic that relies on isolating an enemy.
Yeah.
The term siege itself isn't explicitly defined, but the actions that constitute a siege are heavily regulated by the rules protecting civilians.
Okay, so the actions are regulated.
Right. The framework makes it clear that sieges can only be directed exclusively against the enemy's armed forces.
The text outlines a very specific set of rules here. It says civilians must not be trapped, they must be allowed to leave the besieged area safely, and forced displacement, like kicking them out of their homes permanently, is prohibited. The besieging army must give advance warning of attacks. Furthermore, impartial humanitarian organizations have a right to offer their services, and the besieged party must consent to let aid in if they cannot provide basic survival supplies for their own population.
When you read those rules on paper, it paints a picture of a very polite, orderly siege.
Yeah. It imagines a scenario where the opposing armies just agree to fight it out inside the city limits, but the civilians are allowed to quietly pack their suitcases, walk through the frontline checkpoints, and go stay with relatives in a neighboring town until the war is over.
It's a theoretical fantasy.
Exactly, because the framework immediately undercuts this. The very next line plainly admits the grim reality. However, civilians also get trapped.
Always.
It notes that modern sieges are inevitably accompanied by relentless bombardment, resulting in little or no power, degraded public services, the total collapse of hospitals, and destroyed water and sewage systems.
Yeah.
We have seen this play out in cities like Grozny, Aleppo, and Mariupol.
It's the devastating reality of modern urban warfare. When you surround a city of 1 million people, you aren't just trapping soldiers. You are suffocating a complex civilian ecosystem.
So I have to ask a very blunt, cynical question here.
Go for it.
If IHL explicitly dictates that civilians cannot be trapped, but the official humanitarian framework notes explicitly admit that civilians always get trapped, and the urban infrastructure inevitably collapses into a medieval nightmare of starvation and disease, isn't the law just a useless illusion?
I hear that.
I mean, what is the point of a legal rule that is structurally designed to be broken by the very nature of the tactic?
I understand the cynicism completely.
Hmm.
When you look at the drone footage of a flattened city, the law looks utterly impotent.
Right.
But you have to shift your perspective on what the law is actually designed to do in these situations.
Okay. How so?
The law is not a magical, invisible force field that physically repels a tank shell. The law is the benchmark for accountability. And, more importantly, in the moment, it is the crucial leverage used for negotiation.
Leverage. How does a piece of paper provide leverage against an invading army?
Without the Geneva Conventions explicitly stating that civilians must be allowed to leave and that aid must be allowed in, humanitarian groups would have absolutely zero legal footing to approach a besieging general. If the law didn't exist, a general would just laugh at the Red Cross and say, "It's a siege, starving the city is the entire point, go away."
Because the law exists, it creates friction.
Exactly. Because the law exists, humanitarians can walk into a command center and say, "You are actively committing a war crime. You need to pause the artillery bombardment for exactly 24 hours so we can establish a safe marked corridor to evacuate the wounded children."
So it gives them a bargaining chip.
Yes. The international community can threaten future war crimes, tribunals, allied nations can threaten to pull military funding, and that combined pressure forces the general to open a window. The law doesn't prevent the siege from happening, but it provides the crowbar needed to pry open brief, life-saving ceasefires that pull thousands of people out of the rubble.
That makes profound sense. It's not a shield. It's a tool for negotiators. Okay, so that is the physical asphyxiation of a city. But the framework also dives into the economic and political asphyxiation of an entire country through sanctions.
This is a massively complex area of international relations, where different branches of global law violently collide.
The text defines sanctions as a non-military means of coercion applied in various domains such as diplomatic, economic, or cultural relations. They are used to pressure a state or a non-state actor into changing their behavior without firing a single shot, and they are completely allowed under IHL.
Right. In the modern era, sanctions are heavily favored by the international community as the quote-unquote civilized alternative to armed conflict. Instead of launching cruise missiles and risking civilian casualties, you freeze a rogue nation's central bank accounts, embargo their oil exports, and cut them off from the global financial system to force them to the negotiating table.
But here's where it gets incredibly dangerous for aid operations. The notes point out a major, almost catastrophic clash between the UN's counterterrorism framework and international humanitarian law.
It's a huge problem.
The text states, if working in areas under said sanctions, there is a risk that humanitarian dialogue and activities would be assimilated to material support to criminal groups.
Yes.
Unpack this for us, because this is wild. How does handing out blankets and medicine turn into material support for international terrorism?
Let's trace this back to our core principles at the top of the show. Impartiality and independence.
Okay.
Imagine a humanitarian doctor operating a clinic in a territory entirely controlled by a militant group that the UN Security Council has designated as a global terrorist organization. A fighter from that group comes into the clinic missing a leg, bleeding out. Under the Geneva Conventions and fundamental medical ethics, the doctor must treat that wounded person.
Right, because they are hors de combat. They are out of the fight.
Exactly. But under the incredibly strict architecture of global counterterrorism sanctions established after 9/11, providing any service, including medical care, or paying local administrative taxes to that militant group, simply to allow an aid convoy to cross a bridge.
Yeah.
That can be legally construed by Western governments as providing material support to a terrorist entity.
That is an impossible paradox.
It created a massive existential crisis for the global humanitarian sector. Suddenly, a doctor flawlessly following the Geneva Conventions on the ground was being treated as an international criminal by a different branch of international law.
So they were trapped between two laws.
Western banks began engaging in what's called de-risking. They were so terrified of being hit with billion-dollar fines for accidentally violating anti-terror laws that they simply froze the bank accounts of legitimate aid agencies.
So an aid agency trying to buy, like, aspirin for a clinic in Syria or Afghanistan literally couldn't transfer the money to pay for it.
Exactly. Aid agencies had to resort to carrying suitcases of physical cash across borders just to keep their hospitals running, which obviously is incredibly dangerous. The counterterrorism laws were effectively suffocating the humanitarian laws.
Which leads us to the monumental fix mentioned in the framework. UN Security Council Resolution 2664 passed very recently in 2022.
Yes, a very big deal.
It states explicitly that sanctions should not impact humanitarian relief work, and it legally permits the necessary provision of funds to carry out that relief work.
Resolution 2664 was a massive collective sigh of relief for the humanitarian world. It essentially created a permanent legal carve-out, a shield.
Okay, so it protected them.
It told the global banking system and national intelligence agencies that authentic, impartial humanitarian aid is explicitly exempt from counterterrorism sanctions. It reaffirmed the fundamental truth that saving human lives is not terrorism.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and summarize the immense ground we've covered in this deep dive so far. We have explored the philosophical bedrock of humanitarianism. We have examined the brutal reality on the ground, from the split-second decisions of armed medics to the devastating mathematics of urban sieges.
And we know that despite this intricate architecture of laws, the rules are frequently, brutally, and intentionally broken.
Which brings us to the final critical piece of the puzzle. The law is only as good as the mechanism used to enforce it. Accountability.
Exactly. In the fog of war, how does the international community actually keep track of all these violations to ensure the accountability that the UN constantly demands?
This brings us to surveillance as a shield and the WHO dashboards.
We live in the information age, and data has quietly become one of the most powerful weapons in enforcing international law.
The framework lists 4 different technological systems used to monitor global crises. Let's run through them. First is the SSA, the surveillance system for attacks on healthcare. This is a globally available database that systematically collects primary data on attacks against healthcare workers, facilities, and transport. And crucially, it notes that this system is publicly available.
This connects directly back to that World Health Assembly resolution we discussed earlier, the 2012 one demanding the WHO collect this data.
Right.
The SSA is the physical manifestation of that mandate.
Then there is the Global Health Cluster, which supports local and country levels with practical and technical assistance, using country-specific dashboards to track ongoing health activities in chaotic environments. We also have the WHO Health Emergency Dashboard, which monitors public health crises globally, offering a real-time snapshot of the diseases and emergencies the WHO is responding to worldwide.
Very comprehensive systems.
And finally, the Global Digital Health Monitor, which helps countries prioritize and track their digital health interventions. So how do these actually change things on the ground?
What is truly revolutionary about these systems is how they pierce the fog of war. Historically, in a conflict, misinformation is just as prevalent as gunfire.
Of course.
A hospital is destroyed in a war zone. State A immediately issues a press release saying State B bombed it. State B goes on television and says, no, State A blew it up themselves as a false flag operation.
All right.
Or that it was full of weapons.
Right. It instantly becomes an unsolvable propaganda war.
But with a systematized, publicly available database like the SSA, you aren't just relying on rumors, biased press releases, or blurry cell phone videos.
You have actual data.
Exactly. These dashboards utilize satellite imagery, verified local reporting, and standardized methodology to transform chaotic rumors into verified, time-stamped data points.
Oh, wow.
They track the exact GPS coordinates of the strike, the specific type of munition used, the precise number of casualties, and the structural damage.
Yeah.
It takes the emotion and the political spin out of the equation and creates an immutable, objective ledger of facts.
And years later, that cold, hard ledger can be walked into an international tribunal in The Hague to prosecute commanders for war crimes.
Data is the ultimate countermeasure against impunity.
It is incredible to trace the evolution of the concepts we've covered today. Like, we started with a guy wearing a Red Cross armband standing on a muddy post-WWII battlefield in 1949, and we end with a global, interconnected digital database tracking treaty compliance via satellite in 2026.
The technological tools adapt, sure, but the core mission protecting humanity from its own destructive capacity in its absolute darkest moments remains exactly the same.
When we started this deep dive, we were looking at a stack of documents that appeared to be dry academic legal texts. But I hope that after journeying through this material with us, you now see that these are actually dynamic, living frameworks.
They're the blueprint for survival.
Right. They aren't abstract theories. They are survival rules negotiated in blood during the most violent chapters of human history. Knowing these rules fundamentally changes how you interact with the world. When you watch the news tonight and see a report about an airstrike in a city, You are going to hear it differently now.
You are going to be listening for whether the reporter mentions proportionality.
Exactly. You now understand the specific legal architecture behind why a hospital attack is reported the way it is, and why a military spokesperson is trying so hard to justify it on television.
You understand why an aid agency might risk going bankrupt by refusing funding from a certain government just to maintain their structural independence.
And you understand why the ICRC demands absolute, uncompromising secrecy in its prison visits to leverage reciprocity and save lives. You now know the rules of the invisible boxing ring.
But as we close this analysis, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought.
Okay.
A question that builds upon everything we've unpacked in this source material, but looks toward a very uncertain horizon.
I love a good hypothetical that keeps me up at night. Lay it on us.
The Geneva Conventions were designed in 1949 for physical warfare men with physical guns fighting on land and sea. The additional protocols in 1977 handled physical proxy wars. The WHO is now using digital dashboards to track physical bombs hitting physical hospitals. But the world is rapidly accelerating towards cyber warfare.
Oh, wow. The unseen battlefield.
Imagine a scenario tomorrow where a state-sponsored hacker remotely infiltrates a major city's water treatment plant, or completely bricks the power grid of a massive civilian hospital from a continent away without firing a single physical bullet.
Just a few keystrokes.
Right. The hospital's ventilators shut off instantly. The city's water supply becomes contaminated and undrinkable. Thousands of civilians could die, and the infrastructure is totally incapacitated. But there is no bomb crater. There are no soldiers to surrender to. There are no medics with sidearms.
So how does the First Geneva Convention handle a line of malicious code? How do you apply the mathematics of proportionality to a computer virus?
Exactly. International humanitarian law is currently struggling to keep up with the digital domain. So the question to mull over is this. As warfare becomes increasingly invisible and entirely digital, how long will it be before humanity is forced to sit down at the table once again to draft a purely digital Fifth Geneva Convention?
And what does a digital Red Cross emblem even look like, and how do you protect it?
Exactly.
That is a terrifying, fascinating, and deeply necessary thought to end on. Because whether it is a street fight in an alleyway, a massive artillery barrage across a trench, or a silent cyber attack crippling a power grid, humanity is always going to need those ropes around the ring. We are always going to need those rules to pull us back from the edge of the void. Thank you for joining us on this intricate journey through the legal foundations of humanitarian action. Until next time.